the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you are answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
Well, thank you, Dibs, and thank you all for coming. It's actually a pleasure for me to be here and to be back on the Stevens Institute campus, where I've been a handful of times over many years. So a beautiful place and a beautiful day, right? So I don't really come to teach you anything. I really am here to inspire you and to learn from you and to make myself available to you. I feel like it's been a privilege for me to be able to follow my passions. And I often tell people that I have worked with, if you find your passion and you pursue that, the world will support you, right? So you bring more energy to what you do, and the world gives you more energy back for it. So in a way, I feel like my passion has really been my fuel. I started life, not too atypical, but I identified a kind of curiosity about the way the world works. So I would, my dad was he was the general manager of a manufacturing facility, and I used to go there and stand there and watch men work. It was always men. There were never women on the factory floor back then. But I was fascinated watching them use tools to get a job done, right? And you start to see, okay, it all makes sense. It's very logical and very practical. So I've had this very sort of curious and practical interest. I am a lifelong, now transoceanic sailor. So I started, before I knew how to walk, I was strapped in a cockpit. And over the years, I started sailing more and more and crossing oceans. And I feel like I credit sailing with having really steered me towards sustainability, because it is an elegant way to both work against nature for your survival and work with nature to get accomplished what you want, in this case, transportation, right? So I sort of had this sort of innately cooked into who I was, and then when I went to college, I started by studying political science and quickly switched to architecture. From my own perspective, I wanted to do something that I felt was very tangible, hands-on, and fit my curiosity and interest in how things work. And somewhere probably around the time I was in college, I don't think I went to college with an understanding of myself that being committed to making the world a better place was actually going to become a big driver for me. But in fact, that became one of the significant interests. So while I studied architecture, I worked for the college cabinet maker. And by the time I got my degree in architecture and design, my interest was green building. So this is, I think I graduated in 1979 and foolishly believed that green was a tidal wave. And I could not imagine doing anything that wasn't focused on the green movement. So back in, I think it was 1975 was probably the first Earth Day, and by 76 I was making a model of a parabolic solar collector boiling water in a copper tube on the college quad, right? Kooky girl. But by the time I came out, I was interested not only in becoming a green builder, but I decided, okay, I have learned how to design things. I've certainly learned to do some drafting. I've done a little bit of engineering, et cetera, et cetera. I've got to go learn how to be a builder. So I moved to Maine, much to my parents' horror, put on a pair of work boots, and went to work as a minimum wage carpenter. It was $4.85 at that time. And at the end of every week, believe it or not, I would have saved a little bit of money, and I'd go to the hardware store and I'd buy tools. And every week I would buy some more tools. And you know, I went from $4.85 an hour to $5.50 an hour to $6.75 an hour. I think I got 5 raises in the first year. And I was passionate about it. And I was learning, and I was excited, and I was working with a bunch of, I was on the very tail end of the Back to the Land hippie movement, right? People, my friends, all said, oh my gosh, you're a hippie. And I would say, in 1968, I was 12 years old and wearing kilts and knee socks, right? So I really wasn't a hippie, but I was influenced by those folks. I thought they were interesting, and they were all gardeners and carpenters, and it was Maine, so lots of them were sailors, and this was a lifestyle that started to make sense to me. So I went from girl carpenter to lady contractor, and then started incorporating my design skills and my design degree, and really became a designer builder. And for those 10 years, I mean, I was managing, by the end, I was managing 3 or 4 sizable projects at a time, and I had a crew of 20 people, and I got to the point where I thought, okay, I've learned what I wanted to know about this, and I thought if I took one more lawyer's wife through the Kohler showroom, I might shoot myself, you know? So it was sort of time for me to keep rolling, and that for me has been a pattern, which has been to stay engaged and to stay enthusiastic about that engagement, not only to earn a living, but also it became my personal identity, right? I didn't get married and didn't have kids and didn't have a lot of other things that might have distracted me to some extent. And so my work really became the thing that filled me up all along the way. And when I get to the end, you'll see, like, I came out of 5 years of retirement to go back into it because I found a situation that was really exciting and new and leading edge, and thought I could add some significant value, and it was enough to get me moving again. But by the time I was ready to retire as a contractor, designer, builder, I coached my employees at the time. I had, as I said, I probably had 10 full-time and another dozen subcontractors that I was using regularly. And I sat them all down and I said, I want to move on and go do something else, and I want to pass my business on to you. And they were all like, oh, no, 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 no. And I said, listen, once a week over the next 6 months, we'll sit down and I'm going to coach you so that you can do this. I've been making a living on you, really. And it ended up being one of the things I'm extremely proud of, is that that crew of people went on to flourish and continue to make more money than they had made previously and were a success. When I left construction, I sort of wandered out of Maine. Maine was a small place, and I was almost at the point when the neighbors were like, "Oh, I saw so and so going down the road to your place," and I was like, "Oh my gosh, they watch." um, so I launched myself at the big world. I had been running with a band of poets and sculptors and composers and painters, and I thought, okay, I have an idea, and that is to represent the arts as a resource for business, government, academic institutions. So I started moving. I acquired a small farm in Hawaii back when I was in my late 20s, and I started moving back and forth between Maine and Hawaii, with stops in New York and LA and Santa Fe, where I would touch in with the arts community. And that sort of confluence of arts and business was a place that I thought I had something valuable to contribute. And the steep part of the learning curve has always been a place where I flourished, or at least was drawn to, and spent a fair amount of time. And eventually, as I was coming through New York a lot, I was given, it's a meandering path I'm explaining to you, but I was given an archive of a very interesting woman who had been a cultural attaché for the State Department under Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. She had managed a lot of projects. I mean, the idea for Lincoln Center came up in her office, and she carried it to her friends, Vivian Beaumont Allen and Alice Tully, and all the people who, John D. Rockefeller III, all the people who ended up putting in the money to make that project a reality. And she opened, she represented the United States at Salut à la France, a big international project, and Congress Hall in Berlin. And in 1966, she represented the United States at a conference, a big multi-country celebration and investigation of the arts, sciences, economics, and politics of continental and diaspora in Africa, and it was all based on this concept of negritude, Francophone, African, poet-led movement that became political. And Georges Pompidou was president during the 60s, and all of his classmates from the Sorbonne in the 30s were basically put into place as heads of state. And a president of Senegal, who was president, I think, for, 21 years maybe, a man named Leopold Sédar Senghor, who ended up becoming a pen pal of mine. And I had this big idea. I know what I'm going to do next. I'm going to throw myself at New York City, and Dave Dinkins was the mayor, and I thought, okay, the time is now. We're going to do this. Big vision. I often have said, if I've been a little bit of a victim of my own vision. However, it has all in, I'd say, worked out. So what I'd really like to impart to all of you is, don't be shy, don't be timid, set your sights on what really turns you on, and go for it. And go for it, and go for it, and go for it. And convince people who don't get it that you have something that's concrete and clear in your mind. I mean, when I started as a green builder, folks were like, huh? What? Why? The guy at the lumberyard counter would be, you need what? You need an air-to-air heat exchanger? Why? What is that? But it's worth it. Because if you're right, if your intuition is on and your intellect is applied, you're probably going to make a difference. And that in and of itself is a return. And as I've said, you'll probably make a living along the way as well. So I came to New York City, I threw myself at this project, and lo and behold, I was introduced to somebody that a mutual friend thought might be able to help me. He said this guy was a very close friend of Martin Luther King's, and he was the president of the National Urban League. He was this, he was that. I said, I'll meet anybody because I know where I'm trying to go. And that was a gentleman named Theodore Keel, a guy who, one of the reasons I came to Stevens Institute a long time ago is he was given an honorary doctorate here. So I think I sat on that field in the hot sun while he got that doctorate. But Ted Keel was a very interesting guy. He was a philanthropist of significant order, but he was legendary as a labor mediator and a deal maker, and he'd been involved in lots of things, and he had a very good eye for people. I have often said to people, it wasn't by mistake that Ted Keel selected me. And over the course of working with him for 18 years, I became the person he relied on the most. I ran a couple of foundations for him, one of which was Earth Pledge Foundation. My main role at Earth Pledge was really as CEO, right? I was the executive director, so it was my vision. He provided an enormous amount of access. I mean, the doors and windows of New York and beyond were flung open for the fact that I worked with him. And meanwhile, he became my patron, right? He was funding my ideas, and he made me argue hard for them, I assure you. It's not like he just folded and handed over the checkbook, but it forced me to hone my thinking, and by delivering these ideas and a plan for how to execute these ideas, I won his trust and I won his support. So we had a beautiful little townhouse that I found on East 38th Street. I renovated it. So one of the things I have done that I would really encourage you all to do is build on your strengths. Utilize what you've done in the past that was successful that you can bring to what's new. So I had been a green builder, as I said. I have a degree in architecture and design. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization. I really wasn't there to be a contractor, was I? On the other hand, I saw an opportunity. It's kind of like reading the woods for the openings rather than for the trees. So I then went to all of the product purveyors as well as the contractors and said, explained a vision. I have a vision of taking this small 100-year-old townhouse that was originally built for Abraham Lincoln's granddaughter, and I want to turn it into a state-of-the-art green building utilizing the best of modern design while saving the very best elements of a beautiful old building. So all the way down to, we had American chestnut trim and doors in this place. I mean, the tree is virtually extinct at this point. So I put in the labor to strip it all down and flip doors around where the new floor plan required it, et cetera, and installed state-of-the-art technology from heating and cooling and communications systems. We put the first green roof on a building in Manhattan. And I installed, I didn't do the waterproofing, but I did the install of the green roof itself. I didn't mention, but I've done a lot of gardening, so I'm a passionista about plants and gardening. And I'll never forget, I was spreading the growing media on the green roof, and it hit me, oh my gosh, this is a very big idea. And that was the beginning of the Earth Pledge Green Roofs Initiative, which went on to train thousands of architects, engineers, landscape designers, policymakers. We had a policy roundtable that met once a month of city, state, and federal officials. People would show up from the Forest Service, had never even heard of a green roof. I mean, today you all know what a green roof is. I know that. But believe it or not, back then, they didn't. We helped Mike Bloomberg's Plan YC create incentives for green roofs, tax incentives in New York City. So we took a multi-pronged approach. We worked across food and agriculture systems, so very early in promoting local and sustainable agriculture. And because we had put this spectacular kitchen in this building that we had just renovated, we were able to work with the top chefs in the city who knew nothing about green roofs, knew nothing about combined sewage overflow or urban heat island effect or some of the other problems that green roofs mitigate, and yet tie it together, and we're up on a green roof and we're picking herbs and vegetables and bringing them down into the kitchen and hosting sustainable cuisine cooking classes. So this idea of bringing all the ideas back on themselves has made a lot of sense for me. Let's see, I mentioned that I had a farm in Hawaii, I think, you know, a passionate gardener. I had a garden in Maine. I was growing all the Northeast plants, and I thought, tropical. I need a little tropical juxtaposition for my life in Maine. And I had sailed from Hawaii to San Francisco a few years earlier while I was still in college, in between semesters. And so I ended up buying a small farm on the Big Island of Hawaii, and basically pursued over 31 years the development of a personal Garden of Eden. So I went about planting all the things I like to eat. I didn't plant anything I didn't like to eat. The flowers that I love the smell of, or the ones that I really like on my table, or whatever. And I used it as my sort of escape routine from the city. Sometimes I got there 4, 5, 6 times a year. Sometimes it would only be a couple of times, but it created a balance for me that felt really healthy. I sold that farm in late 2015 after buying a new farm in Asheville, North Carolina. Anybody here know Asheville, North Carolina? Cool place. Kind of goes along with Austin as one of the go-to spots for young, smart, liberal, you know, lots happening, great foodie scene, great architecture, nature, surrounded by big nature, beautiful nature. And, you know, as I was looking ahead at my 60s, I sort of thought, okay, Hawaii to New York is a long haul. And I live out on the east end of Long Island, so it didn't look like sitting on the side of a mountain on the Big Island of Hawaii was a good thing for me well into my 70s or 80s. So I thought, okay, got to have a farm, and closer might be better. And just as I bought the farm in North Carolina, I renovated a small 1935 log cabin, and it had been a tobacco farm. North Carolina was tobacco territory. And I'll bet there's not a smoker in the room. I don't know, you know, not many, I'm sure. But in the United States, we used to subsidize tobacco, believe it or not. And because we no longer do, and tobacco is pretty much, I mean, we might export a fair amount of it still, but it is a tiny industry compared to what it was. These farms were not very expensive, and all the infrastructure is sort of crumbling and hanging on barely, and most folks don't have any equipment anymore. I was just pulling this place together and saying, okay, this is kind of the next something, and I didn't know what I was going to do with the farm, so I had a local farmer grazing it, and out of nowhere, one of my former employees at Earth Pledge came to me and said, I have some friends who are doing something I think you're going to really enjoy your dinner. you're going to enjoy, and I think you could add value here. I should mention, or I guess it was in my bio, when I was in Hawaii starting in the 80s, became very familiar with the history of the cannabis industry in the United States. And so I learned about it a little bit, and then I got interested enough. And in addition to my day job in New York, I teamed up with a couple of people. One was a designer, and one had the money, and I had the hemp knowledge. And we created a small hemp fashion company. Fashion business, super tough. I mean, we had all of our line at a little store called Planet Hemp, and Woody Harrelson came in and bought the whole rack, and I said, that's it, we're out of the fashion business. No more of that. But because I was working with someone who was a philanthropist who trusted me at that point, I was able to do some financing of the very earliest drug policy reform movements here. Actually, the guy who went on to create the Drug Policy Alliance was a professor at Princeton, and he ran something called the Linda Smith Center. George Soros was supporting it. There were a couple of real, folks with money who were progressive, who saw that this cannabis thing made no sense. From a social justice perspective, it doesn't make sense. And for the opportunity, of course, for medicine, food, fuel, building materials, phytoremediation, I mean, you name it. This plant has a lot to offer. So I, wrote a few checks or got a few checks written, and that was all great. And so this friend comes along and introduces me to these two young men who were building at the time the most tech-enabled robotic cannabis growing operation, certainly in the state of New Jersey. And 5 years ago, I would say it probably was the most sophisticated in the world. So I was coming back and forth between Asheville and Shelter Island, and I said, I'll pass through New Jersey, I'll meet you, let's see what you got, what are you doing? And I showed up, and we started to talk, and while I'm not responsible for the construction, I know enough about construction that I can add some value. While I'm not responsible for cultivation, again, I'm familiar enough with growing cannabis and other things, so familiar. And the thing I thought I really could deliver for them that they didn't have at all was a really solid communications platform. So I became the director of communications for what is now called Harmony Dispensary. It's located in Secaucus. We opened about, I want to say 4 months ago, I think, just about 4 months ago. And I built out the dispensary, and I developed the web platform and the Instagram feed, and I still do all of the customer service that's online. I always say I'm not really nice enough for retail, so I don't run the store part of it, the dispensary itself. But it's been a fascinating adventure. I am thrilled that we are really at this watershed moment in history, and it's a lot of fun. And I think at the end of the day, I'm going to assume I'm here for one life, and I already know that life is really short. So, staying engaged, being turned on, continuing to add value has felt like the right thing to do, and it's been exciting. And I'm sure you're all seeing it in the media and all around you, and New Jersey is likely by the end of this year to have adult use. So you won't even any longer need to qualify for one of the qualifying conditions. However, I will tell you that these days, since Governor Murphy stepped in, the qualifying conditions have become broad. Anxiety, anybody have any? College students who don't have anxiety? I don't know what that is. 8-year-olds have anxiety. Yeah, or chronic pain, and we're finding that a lot of people, some of whom maybe used to use marijuana when they were teenagers in the 60s, went off and had families and kids and, jobs where they would never think about using cannabis, have now started to come around as people who have inflammation, some sleep disorders, some pain. I hate to tell you, but at some point, pain is usually part of it, whether it's your shoulders or your back or your hips or whatever it is, and a lot of them have been starting to realize that alcohol becomes harder and harder to actually participate with actively. I mean, back in the old days, I was a serious foodie and I was running all over New York with, the best chefs and restaurateurs in the game. You can be sure that I had my share of foie gras and good red wine. I can't do it anymore. A little sometimes, but not de rigueur, right? So cannabis is finding its way into a lot of people's lifestyles. And if used responsibly, it is turning out to be a really positive thing. And let alone the governor is now considering opioid use, opioid abuse, or opioid use disorder, they call it. People say to me, what is that? I say, well, it's abuse of opioids, that's what it is. That's a public health crisis, right? You start for one reason that looks like a good one. Okay, you're in pain, you take it, you take too much of it, you take it too long. Oh, that feels kind of good. Okay, and now you're addicted, and then you die sometimes. It's like, whoa, has to be stopped. And I think cannabis has a very interesting role to play in that. About a year ago, the state of North Carolina issued an open call for farmers, had to be a farmer, to issue licenses to grow hemp. And the state of North Carolina Department of Agriculture sees this as an opportunity for all those tobacco farmers who literally cannot take care of their families, right? You can't earn a living growing tobacco, often not such great educations, unable to really care for their kids or send their kids off to college. And so it's been a really terrible economic cycle in North Carolina. And behind Kentucky and Colorado, North Carolina is now stepping out as a serious player in the hemp industry. So I applied for one of those licenses, and I'll even admit to you, I do occasionally I need to do an alternate side parking thing in New York City. And the parking ended at 10, and the conference call when they were announcing the licenses started at 10, so I was like, well, I'm just going to sit in my car and listen to this call, and put myself on mute. And I have to admit, I cried when they called me out as, number 17. And I have just finished up my harvest of 10 acres of hemp grown for CBD flour. We started it last January with 160 seedlings, cuttings. Grew them into mothers, cloned them into 1,600 seedlings, grew them into mothers, cloned them into 16,000 seedlings, and planted 10 acres. And the first time I was down there when the plants were in the field, I have a partner that's doing a lot of the farming on the ground. I'm obviously up here a lot working. And a friend of mine called and I was on the phone and she said, oh, it must be beautiful. And I said, I am so overwhelmed by how much work this has been to get here and how much work is ahead. And it really brought home for me, as somebody who has been a passionate gardener for many, many years, decades now, and a real passionista about agriculture and a supporter of sustainable agriculture, and developed programs with the support of big companies like Quaker and Lexus and Bank of America and others. It really, and my farm in Hawaii was tiny by comparison. I told you it was like a Garden of Eden, right? And this now was farming. And what a lesson in how hard it is, right? Everybody knows that the value chain, as you go up the value chain, and the processing and the branding and the marketing and the sales and distribution, et cetera, is where all the money is. And the farmers always get the last little bit and the smallest amount. And it's, you know, I always say we should all thank farmers daily for delivering not only medicine, of course, but also our food and our fiber and the rest of it, because it is on their backs, by and large, that we get what we get out of the ground, other than mining, of course. So at Harmony, I've kind of on a lark, I've started an apiary. We have 8 beehives. I was able to harvest about 100 pounds of honey about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I'm just buttoning them up and putting them to bed for the winter. In fact, my car has bee food in it that I made last night in my kitchen, you know, so I'm kind of still hands on it in all ways. My goal is to have an extracted cannabis product infused into the honey as our first consumable, which I think will be really sweet and a nice, you know, a nice story, because I am, at the end of the day, in my role as director of communications, I'm a storyteller, and so I try to make story that tracks along this whole perspective about sustainable lifestyle and how to close the loop and stay conscious. And I say make the world a better place, but at the end of the day, for me, it's both an adventure and the way to make it all make sense. So I've told you enough about me, that's for sure. And so I'm really curious to know from all of you, like, what are the things within my story that resonate for you, or where are you all either coming from or going to, right? Where are the dreams? Where are the big ideas? How many of you are engineers? Half, maybe. Cool. Any, please.
Just for curiosity.
Sure.
What made you switch from political science to architecture? You didn't like politics? Or?
Well, I've learned a lot about politics since, certainly. And it's part of, you know, even in my role at Harmony, I mean, I do a lot of interacting with the State Department of Health or the governor's office or mayors and council people of local municipalities, because we need their cooperation. And I don't know how much you follow it, but you know, the politics around cannabis are wild. I mean, from a sailor's perspective, we call it sloppy seas. It's like when the wind and the tide are against each other and the water is shallow, what happens? The waves come up, and you know, there's no rhythm to it. It's wacky. But to answer your question, I think I wanted to do something that felt more practical. Just sort of more tangible and practical, and seemed like more fun. It was more fun for me. Yeah.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Generally, people say that everyone associates sustainability to money, saying that it can be costly, green buildings can be a little more investment than regular buildings and all these things. Did you encounter this when you were making green buildings for others?
I did, of course. you always, I mean, in the very early days when I was in Maine, I mean, Mainers are frugal, right? I mean, and so a practical explanation of how these buildings were better, what the return on investment is. So let's assume there is an investment. I mean, that air-to-air heat exchanger doesn't come for free, and then it also has to be installed. However, if the net result is you're recapturing the heat that's in your indoor air that you've already spent money to heat, while simultaneously delivering fresh air, which is crucial. Air exchanges now are written into a building code. Back then they weren't. But, you know, so it's about return on investment. And while I was at Earth Pledge, often one of the approaches we would take was to do the research to identify and deliver data on what are the returns. Green roofs was a great example because the returns were myriad. There wasn't just one, right? So those who worry about combined sewage overflow were actually different people often than were worried about the urban heat island effect. And whether you were worried about your air conditioning costs or whether you were worried, you know, you worked at the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, which is, you know, almost always under a court order for all of the sewage that's dumped raw into our waterways, right? So it requires research. There was a question earlier about CBD, and the same question, frankly, for THC or the other 180 odd cannabinoids. We don't know enough. When you pioneer new technologies, new solutions to problems that are clear, right? Identifying problems is usually the thing we do pretty well. It's not that hard to do, if we're honest. But once you identify potential solutions, it's incumbent on you to then start figuring out where the costs are and where the benefits are. And so it's, you know, sometimes it's an individual that needs to decide, am I going to go for triple glazed windows or not? Am I going to insulate my house or not? Or in the case of opioid use disorder, I'd say you have a public health crisis, or you have an energy crisis that's significant and affects us all. It's not just the guy who lives in the house over there. It's all of us. So, and the public costs also need to be quantified. And the good news is that governments are getting better at this, even on the local level. In fact, sometimes better on the local level. You know, really saying, okay, these are real problems that we cannot just keep pushing off to future generations. We need to start to legislate and spend to fix them.
We have one question from online audience.
Okay.
With your experience with communications, do you think social media is a good way of helping destigmatize cannabis while also communicating the nuances of recreational use?
Well, first of all, I use social media actively, and I am blown away, frankly, by how effective it is. I mean, in the old days, I mean, I used to have a press book that was inches thick, right? And I would pick up the phone and call the New York Times or, you know, place stories because they made sense, et cetera, et cetera. And we had very few ways to push out in any kind of narrow cast way to an audience that might be receptive. So I have found social media to be fabulously effective. It's fast-paced, and the platforms change and vary, but I think telling those stories and sharing some of the campaigns and sharing some of the range of people that are realizing benefit. And personally, if you ask me, I'm less concerned about the tax revenue side of things, just because it's not where I come from, but I do believe the social justice piece of adult use has to be addressed. I mean, it just has to be addressed. And the most important thing, of course, is responsible use. And, you know, what rules we manage to put in place and what technologies we manage to put in place. There's a lot of concern about driving under the influence of cannabis. Okay, is there a test that can be developed? The person who develops the test that tests your, you know, recent cannabis use on the road will be a wealthy person, because it's almost one of the most legitimate concerns that we hear, right, from a public safety perspective. And the good news is nobody's ever died from using cannabis. Something I didn't mention that I have found fascinating, so I'm growing hemp for CBD extraction out of the cannabis flower, and only in the last 7 or 8 months have I become aware that there's a burgeoning smokable flower market happening, with more and more people starting to smoke hemp flour, which is now, I mean, some people say it's gray area, but I think it's actually, I mean, with Mitch McConnell being from Kentucky, I think we're all safe to say that with the new Farm Bill, CBD is legal everywhere and can be moved across borders. You can buy it on Amazon. So I thought that was a really interesting, like, wow, more and more people are using this.
There's a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
If the past presidential election was any indicator, it is very easy for misinformation to be presented online, which has a tangible effect on the real world. If not social media, what kind of solutions would you propose?
Other mechanisms for communicating messages? Oh, you know, I think it's fabulous that our commissioner of the Department of Health is doing grand rounds in hospitals. That is a great communication vehicle from the highest level, he's a doctor himself, of course, and he's moving around talking to 50, 60, 80 doctors at a time, telling them, from a public health perspective, we need you to start using cannabis as an alternative to some of the prescriptions you're writing. So that's, you know, face-to-face, peer-to-peer, credible peers. Government can help a lot. Campaigns from the government, advertising campaigns help a lot. Hollywood can help, of course. I mean, celebrities have become, in the last 20 years, I would say, an enormous voice that's listened to by the public in a way that 40 years ago, some movie star? No. So I think that's another way, you know, and personally I still talk to the New York Times and subscribe to the New York Times. So there's nothing wrong with some of the older media methods. I just don't think that, first of all, many young people are using those as much. So that might do that. Sure. Sure.
What kind of things have you implemented on your farm as far as sustainable farming practices?
I did a no-till, so I hold the locations for those 16,000 plants. That was a lot of work. We had a very wet year, and as a result did no irrigation whatsoever, only using organic methods. Although we're not organic certified, nobody's got an organic certified hemp crop. But so, you know, organic practice, keeping it simple, no irrigation, no till. That pretty much does it. Used you know, kind of found a source of old hay to use as mulch, so no plastic mulch in the field. As a gardener, I just have a really hard time rolling out all that plastic and imagining you know, a gazillion little pieces of brittle plastic in the soil. Sure. Yeah.
When you're selling your solutions to different people, do you find it's your storytelling or more of the facts and figures that convinces the majority of people?
They go together. A good story has facts, right? My old boss used to say, you can't argue about a fact, you can only be ignorant of it. So I think facts are engaging. I think just a lot of hand waving doesn't really convince all the levels of people and all the range of people that you really need to get on board. And that's why doing research is important. Getting reliable outcomes and data and solid understanding so that you can talk about that return on investment. I mean, even as a farmer, and you know, I'll tell you that farmers are often very close to that line, right, of is there a return on the investment? And they're pouring out money as they start up, and they don't get a return until there's a harvest in the barn, so to speak. And anything other than facts and figures will not convince a farmer to change anything. You know, no saving the planet is enough for a farmer. I mean, they're just too close to the line. Yeah.
So with regards to the farm, what's the cycle of the plant? Is it a robust plant, easier to grow, or do you find it finicky to grow? You know, connection to
So
traditional farming.
it's a weed, right? They call it weed for a reason. I didn't mention, but I was on a special mission to Bhutan to investigate a pretty interesting cannabis project. And it grows everywhere there. It grows wild. And they are one of the greenest countries on earth. So, of course, I mean, it's illegal. So once a year, they have this little period and they try to eradicate it. But they don't spray poison or do any of the things that would be bad for the environment. What do they try to do? They pull it. Pull it? I mean, I have a garden that's like 50 by 150. I can't pull the weeds. You've got cannabis everywhere, side of the road, side of the river, up on the hills, down on the flats. Come on now. So it's a plant that's happy to grow. It's easy to propagate, clone, and they're doing gene splicing and other methods as well.
Is it one harvest a year, or is it harvest?
Well, it depends where you are. In Hawaii, you can get two, but any place you have a frost, no. In North Carolina, I mean, the problem with cannabis is it's susceptible to molds, mildews, mites. You know, it's got some problems. And then if you're going to grow it with organic practice, you know, you're going to be really, you know, maybe you got neem oil as your defense, right? I mean, in your fingers. So, you know, like all plants, each crop has its own quirks and problems, and I think there'll be a lot of new genetics coming out and breeding, right? Because, again, you're into a crop that we have so little real experience with. And the tooling, I mean, the amount, when I said I was overwhelmed, the amount of handwork, because there's no machine that's just plopping all those clones in the ground or doing this or doing that, right? Or harvesting, like. So it's all going to get better and easier, and more farmers are going to grow it. I hope the infrastructure around not just extraction of CBD flour, but also the structural hemp industry. I mean, you can grow a structural hemp, and we can all imagine the building materials and hempcrete and panels and boards, and yet there's nobody in America making these things. So there's a lot of investment opportunity. The Wall Street banker folks are all over it. They have run towards the marijuana industry, for sure. And they have run towards the CBD side of hemp. There is still, I mean, you know, will we ever bring textiles back to America? I don't know. I mean, for the most part, I think we sold off all the equipment and it's in China already, and already they've probably recycled it and are now working with, you know, finer equipment than they were 20 years ago. So I don't know exactly where that potential is going to fall. I think there's going to be some really interesting science around fuel production. And I think the hemp seed industry around a food product is also likely to end up doing well, and yet today it's tiny. I mean, of all the thousands of people that I know who are growing hemp, a handful of them are growing for seed.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hoffman.
You're welcome.
We have to vacate the class for the next one to come in. If you have more questions, we can definitely talk outside in the corridor, or we have the Rocco 201 to discuss. Right? Thank you, Ms.
Cool.
Hoffman.
Of course. Thank you for having me. Thanks for listening. And I didn't bring any business cards with me, but if anybody wants to reach out to me, you're welcome to. I'm Leslie at harmonydispensary.org.